if and when he's got headspace for it. Wow, but I'm really still energetically a little bit with Florian right now.
Yeah. I think.
What a head fuck to be stuck in a situation like that. Anyway, what does it say? Meeting is being recorded. Continue. Yes.
But
okay.
it's good. We are Thomas more than me, but we feel very close to Florian. So of course, it's good to share what happens when you see things like that. You just think of him and his family, and then of course we can go into another space. But it's fine just to honor one moment, the energies that we are basically shooting off from these kind of situations where we handle taking care of each other and the planet in a really unskillful way, and this is just a symbol of it.
And it's actually really interesting as a sort of micro fractal into the conversation that we kind of started last time when we postponed it. And I was thinking this morning about our last conversation and this point of where to find the balance between the global networking of the watering holes or the centers of light or the center of transformation or whatever the place. There are more and more places where a group of people are getting together and saying, okay, let's play game B by living it and making it a reality, and in some way that leaves a bridge for game A to get positively infected by it in the sense of a kind of virus of positive health spreading. And of course, that's hugely important, and resourcing these centers through mutual collaboration and global awareness that they're not alone in it, that they're one expression of an impulse that is coming through Earth, through life. All super important stuff and juicy potential in the learning between these centers. And if I look at what happened with, for example, the Eco-Village network and setting up a network and then seeing the dynamics of the network versus the individual place, it throws up this bigger thing that I also live, again, as a fractal in my own life. Where do we put our energy? In these kind of global conversations or in deeply human, deeply real, local relationships with all their messy complexity, where even the kind of big theorizing of, wouldn't it be nice if we all in this region did that and that, becomes different because you're running into a neighbor you like, who you agree with on 75% of the things, and then you suddenly realize, oh, on this, I completely opposed worldviews. How do I hold this diversity? And you still need to move forward together. And so what I mean is, how do we, when thinking about, and I want to learn more about what you're dreaming into with Pirate Academy, but when thinking about something like a Pirate Academy, how do we resource this deeply local re-inhabitation, reconnection, and make explicit this tension between, please don't get lost in what we're offering online, live it in your community, the works in the real community. I don't know, how do you see it?
Exactly like that. It couldn't be put better. If we can't live it, then fuck it. But still, like I'm building a school here and a lot of networks in Norway with young people, but I still need a Daniel that write amazing things that help me understand where things are heading. I still need to understand that we can live another paradigm, that we are not just enslaved in a wrong paradigm and our work will be wasted. So we need some people that can be part of the global collective community of understanding where we could be heading and building a story that we could believe in, and then we need to do a lot of work locally.
I totally agree. That's with Lars, that what you described is spot on. I think there's one dimension that I noticed that you and all of the other thinkers and writers and educators and out there, for me, seem to be doing. And that is kind of like the role of the shaman to bridge the liminal space and between game A and game B, right? How do you stand in game A while building game B? Finding that language, using the tool set of game A to bring the message out, all of that is a temporary role. And I can also see that some of the people in that space, and that is, I think, what you're addressing, having a hard time stepping out of that role of bridging and going into the role of building. But maybe it's not even their role, right? I have some concrete people in my mind. I'm not going to name them here. That doesn't make any sense. But there are some people.
You said something really important there. Maybe it's not even their role. I think that's another piece that, in terms of awareness raising, as we talk about why are we doing this work, is like, allow me a little parenthesis. Like when I left academia because they just couldn't get the type of truly holistic transdisciplinary work I wanted to do, and sidestepped and ended up at Findhorn College and the Findhorn community. I had just climbed that academic system to get my PhD and had my entry ticket to that community. I had done my postdoctoral for 6 months that brought me to Findhorn. And then suddenly I was in a community where the very fact that I had a PhD was basically making people suspicious of me. And the sort of simplified assumption was, he must be in his head, he can't be in his heart, and he certainly won't be spiritual if he has a PhD. Yeah? And Findhorn has this really strong center of gravity where it takes people from the head into a heart space, back into like what the Sufis call the longest journey of a lifetime, from the head back into the heart. But they do it as an antithesis, as a pendulum swing, as a sort of leaving the head behind, denying the head to come into the heart. And for the longest time while I was there, I was deeply frustrated and wanted to evolve this center that for 50 years has helped people on that journey to reconnect with their heart and feel again, basically. I kind of was banging my head against the wall to say, don't you see, it's all about synthesis and you need to bring it together, and it's about the head and the heart. And of course, some people got it and also some people were there already, but ultimately the place hasn't shifted. And now I'm coming to my point. What I realized is that sometimes we could critique people or center or places as, oh, they haven't got it, they need to move on, where their role is simply that bit of the trajectory for a lot of people. And that's super important. And it's actually auto-sabotaging our transformation by sort of critiquing or not letting people be in these roles, or institutions fill these specific roles in that ecosystem of transformation. Sorry, but I think it's quite important to...
It's important what you said about Findhorn, and if we can't get both the heart space and the mind space, we will not succeed, because we still need to tell stories. We still need to be taught. And what is amazing about, I had the same career as you, was offered to do the academic, but saw that was wrong. But now we can basically build educations or learning spaces that can hold global transformation without being owned by the old paradigms, Daniel. That's really interesting. Mm-hmm. So if we create things where we create programs or knowledge or something that most people need, then we can basically make it available for all people on the planet. They're not stuck with some silly teacher in an old paradigm teaching a book because he needs to earn a living, but it can really be people that are part of creating a new paradigm that can teach us almost for free. That's amazing.
I'd like to add one more. So giving the people space to fill these roles is one thing, but being ready as a person to take on this role and then step out of that role again, that is an extra mile that not everybody is ready to go. Right? So somebody might be super important and critical in developing the language that everybody else can then use to make sense of what is going on and to move towards that. But once that job is done of building that towards that language, and everybody and it has clicked and everybody's using it now, then the job is done, right? What I notice is that some people seem to be overshooting that, right? They're still developing the language, while I think we're at a point where we have enough language, so we have to start building now, and making space for the new leaders that go into the building. I think, and that's somewhere where I would think we would see the Pirate Academy. Scaling it down from, maybe you're familiar with Samo Burya's idea of the life player. Beautiful idea of just saying, okay, we have great leaders who put with their ideas a real dent in the universe, right? They really change the trajectory. Some of them are on the positive end of the spectrum. Some of them are on the horrible end of the spectrum. So both Gandhi and Hitler, for him, are in that category of a life player, because they shape the reality of millions and billions of people. But he puts that in the very high realm of millions and billions of people that you impact. I think with the Pirate Academy, we're scaling that same thing down and saying, okay, you're a life player, but the radius of your influence is local, right? And that does not mean that you're not a super hot guy, right? You're cool, you're a pirate, you're changing the rule set. You don't have to be the super rock star that everybody on the planet admires. You can be local and be cool, right? So that is I think something we're trying to establish and build towards here.
It's funny that the way that, of course, we always hear when somebody else is speaking their frame within the context of our current situation and so on. And as you were speaking, it's almost as if you were not giving me advice, but speaking very much to a dynamic that I feel as I sort of practice tugging on the mask, like questioning my own frames and ideas. I question myself all the time with exactly where you opened. Have I done my piece of work, putting out 460 articles on Medium, and there's the book, and yes, keep that energy going. If I can get it into another language, that's worth a bit of effort, but it's normally a lot of effort for not a lot of return. But seeing, like, when you then get a demand to keep talking, that there's a point where you just can't hear yourself say the same thing again. And then you feel like, oh, how many other people must have the same feeling of, I can't hear this guy say that again. It's also true that I've had experiences where, for example, Stefan Harding at Schumacher College, doing his kind of blending Jungian psychology, Gaia theory, and deep ecology show, which is the same and has been the same for 25 years, but it transforms people. And I also realized that sometimes repeating the same groove, just like what I was saying earlier, takes people along one journey and is important. But I'm very much exactly at the point you just described. This kind of, and it relates one-on-one to what I said earlier. I want to step. Right now, it feels I'm 80% in this global Zoom connected meme seeding, smithing space, and with this move I've just made, and the land that now asks me, like they're literally plants saying, "You're my custodian. I'm either going to die if you don't give me water. If you give me water, I will give you abundance." That's a real invitation to step into this other space, and looking at my neighbors here and saying, "Okay, we could open up all the fences and build one agroforestry system all the way down this hill." And since we all also work in that other space, maybe we need to get a local guy who becomes our farmer, and we create a community-supported agriculture scheme that spans 5 properties next to each other, provides food for those families and possibly the neighbors. And in doing so, doing something real like a pirate, but also creating a whole new pattern that other people could say, "Wait a minute, that's just not a bad idea. If I have 5 good neighbors, and we could part-time employ somebody to turn our gardens into a food forest," and boom. And so, yeah, sorry that I'm babbling on, but
it's perfect. Yeah. It's perfect. It's spot on, right? That's exactly what needs to happen. But I think it takes a super strong self to let go of the ego part of stepping off the stage and saying, "Hey, I'm done, right? I'm gonna tend for my garden now, and for my kids and for my neighbors, and this is my stage now, and I'm really happy with this." I don't have that stage, but I still can feel what it must be like to do that. Because I've stepped out of situations like that in other places, so I think I can empathize. But so yeah.
I think you just made me realize that I should try to, and don't know him actually, but should try to get in touch with Patrick Kingsnorth, because he's pretty much lived that. Okay. He was a major activist, set up Adbusters and really involved. And then I think it was around his mum needing care and him deciding that it was more important to care for his mum than to do this global work. Otherwise, he would be out of integrity. He basically stepped out and just still writes, but lives much more like not the talking circle anymore. Yeah, I think I'm going to take that journey, but we'll see how long it takes. Sometimes things are in transition for a decade.
But Christian, I think it's really easy. I was part of the UN. I was offered to be the Minister of Education in Denmark at some time, but I get really bored up with politics after being in it intensely for some years. And when I go to these global circuses around climate and whatever, where they do the same speeches, I see the people that I could have become. And I'm really, really happy that it was a bumpy road at local level. Being an activist instead of a system builder in a system I don't believe in.
Absolutely.
If it would have been right and we were on the road to create something that was beautiful in human history, of course we would have taken those positions, but you could have been an elite academist or something, but we are trapped. I could have been a politician, definitely, or something like that, an academist as well, but we are like floating around in between because we don't want to go into this in new structures without being the old structures, but still working on a new paradigm. That's the kind of paradox we're in, right?
Well, yeah, I think it's this I find the framing that Joanna Macy, or at least that's where I heard it the first time, offers with this being hospice workers of an old system of game A and midwives of game B is incredibly powerful because of the use of the word hospice and midwife.
Yeah.
It's much more dynamic. It's not system builder. It's not so dead and cold and rational. And what I've always loved this framing, but in teaching it at Schumacher College to people in the Masters in Ecological Design thinking, a student after me offering this framing said something that blew my mind, because I hadn't really seen that dimension of the word hospicing, because I had just hospiced my own father during his last 12 days. So when she gave me this window into that word, I realized the minute you take game A with a hospicing perspective, what do you do when you hospice somebody? Like when I hospiced my father, a lot of stuff came up about, you could have done this and why didn't you do that and why did you? But it was all still there, but it didn't influence the way I interacted with him, because ultimately it was all about giving him peace. And it takes out a very different sort of activist, the old system that is trying to kill us, let's fight it, to really see that with a lot of game A, it's patterns and structures that real human beings are in, who are trapped in that dynamic themselves, and to really be compassionate with that system and help it transition, let go, die, but possibly use the fertile soil of the people, their skills and everything else to actually then build game B and midwife is central. And Joanna also has this, and that's why I thought of it when you were speaking, this notion of the Shambhala Warrior, which is actually this really old Tibetan prophecy of, I think it's a slightly different role to be able to, as a chameleon, walk into these corridors of power and transform them from within. And I think that it's this dance between sometimes taking on these roles. Like I recently, 2 years ago, I was offered to become the Director General for Energy, Climate Change and Transition here on Mallorca under the current government. And I turned it down because I quickly asked a few people who I know who'd been in that role and realized that it's Director General is basically where the buck stops. Like you have no decision making and envisioning power. You get directives, but if something goes wrong in that area, it's you who get blamed. So it wasn't a job for me at all. I felt like it was a poisoned present that they were trying to offer there. But anyway, what I'm trying to get to is this bridge building sometimes means not getting involved deeply with organizations, and sometimes it means for a short time going in there and being a kind of undercover agent. And I think we all played those roles in different ways.
I use a slightly different metaphor for the hospice midwife image, which is caterpillar killing and butterfly birthing.
Yeah, you said that last time. It's nice.
And the reason why I choose this over the other one is that the caterpillar and the butterfly are constituted by the same cells. So the caterpillar dissolves, reconstitutes, reemerges as the butterfly. So this carries the message that you're still going to be there. You're just going to be part of something else, right? If you're using the hospice image, then you're essentially saying you're dying, you're going away, and nobody wants to hear that, really. So
yeah, but then I would maybe reframe the killing, because the killing is also bringing that strongly.
I know.
Do you know the full biological story? I'm sure you do, of the butterfly.
Probably not as much in detail as you do.
No, but it is useful to bring it in because the reason why the logo of the global eco-village network is a butterfly is precisely because of this biological transformation process that you're speaking to. And when you look at how the caterpillar moves into a cocoon stage and then dissolves completely inside that cocoon, the process that actually happens is that there's all along the length axis of the butterfly a set of discs, and they're called imaginal cells. And these imaginal cells suddenly switch on a new program, the game B program, the butterfly. And initially, the mushy dissolving, or no, even before they start the dissolution process, but initially the immune system of the caterpillar fights these cells as if they're invader cells.
Wow.
And as they line up along the length of the body, they begin to build a network between these imaginal discs. And it's out of that network that then the dissolution process of everything around it, and then the butterfly emerges. And that was the same image that basically eco-village as imaginal disc, the eco-village network as the network that connects on a planetary scale this new impulse, and then out of that the butterfly emerges.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and it's very often used. And it's your last little story. I was at an innovation conference in Utrecht, the R3.0 network, and Kate Rayworth was there, and Nora Bateson was there, and for 2 days, this community, which is all about kind of mavericks who are trying to transform. Initially, the reporting state, it was called Reporting 3.0. Now they call it Resilience, Redesign, and Regeneration, R3.0. And there was a lot of talk about transformative innovation. And Nora made this beautiful final butterfly point. She said, after listening to all this talk about transformative innovation that we've been kind of having for the last 2 days, I'm stuck with a question. Is this kind of innovation that we're talking about giving us caterpillars with wings or butterflies? And I thought that was just a brilliant question.
But what you touch into is why it's so important for us to work with local communities. I was in South Africa doing the transition from Thabo Mbeki to Jacob Zuma, which was this corrupt rapist. And I was also in Burma talking to Aung San Suu Kyi before she was released the first time as part of a Nobel interview. And both of them, those systems talked about fear in people. Like the Truth and Reconciliation was basically a process for not going into fear mode and punish mode, but go into compassion mode, right? And in both systems collapsed and went back to the old systems. Why did they do that? Because we hadn't built alternative ways of living for people. So what we are basically doing is that we are, through building local communities, we are building and showing other ways of living that could be in replacement, because if there's no alternatives obvious to people, then the old system will persist. And I was having this talk 2 days ago with some students and say, who are the world leaders today? When I grew up, it was Mandela, but today it's people living locally, trying to transform their lives and reality. That's the leaders. That's the only leaders we have. Maybe that was short circuiting a lot of small conclusions, but it's basically showing that there is an alternative to Game A. We are building.
I think this and this is happening very, very quickly. This notion now suddenly, right? I mean, I know, Daniel, you've been thinking and working on this for a long time, and maybe that it is for me now happening very quickly. Let's say in the last 1-2 years, that real deep understanding of community, local community as the solution is becoming so mainstream that I just saw today that the Italian pavilion at the Biennale will be about local communities as the future, the whole thing. So this is reaching a level where we now can actually step into the concrete and build. And by having these conversations, we just had one with a mutual friend, Jim Rutt, the other day, and it was. I mean, given that Jim has been thinking about all of that stuff for a long time as well. What was really surprising to him, he acknowledged that yesterday in another conversation, that he was thinking through the concrete way of building a community where he lives, disconnected from any game A residual rests of wherever, but being just there and building this and thinking it through. Where do the various resources come from? What are the required roles? What is the real governance that, as soon as you put like faces onto this and say, this guy, my neighbor, do I really want to deal with him in making these decisions? Well, who cares? You have to, right? So it changes the picture a lot. And I think this is where I would like to step towards now in our conversation, to like go into this imagining of the concrete. You started earlier by describing the 5 neighbors, and I mean, this is a beautiful starting point for saying, if you, let's say there's the situation in the Middle East escalates, and let's say there's some really nasty mutations of the virus, and then there's another catastrophe. We can almost like set our timer for the global supply chains breaking down, and at that point you will be cut off, right? You're on this island. You will have to be able to somehow survive there. So maybe we go into that space in your concrete situation. You just landed there on this land. You have these neighbors. You are detached from any game A activity, at least in our minds now. What do you do? How do you actually turn this into action and build a community that you look forward to see your grandchildren grow up in? Would you be interested in exploring that?
To me, the sequencing is critical in that transition. And by going to the scenario in place, or setting the scenario around that kind of abrupt, complete collapse and disconnection, I think it's more likely that we'll find more and more of that collapse in more and more places, and some places will briefly find themselves in that situation, but that we're actually talking about a long period. Like this whole dynamic that was brought in a little bit by Jem Bindell when something clicked in his mind, and he made the mistake of assuming that he'd just seen something that other people hadn't already seen 30 years ago. And then kind of wanted to take it to the world. Don't you see if you don't see it's all collapsing, you're in denial. Yeah. That has polarized into sort of either you're a collapsist or not, the debate. When you really zoom out a bit historically and time-wise from that limited human time frame of a lifespan, you realize that like Nero's been fiddling for a very long time. Like the whole thing has been collapsing for decades, and now we're seeing much more of that, bringing in the hope of the adaptive cycle. And what we learn about change processes in living systems is that collapse is part of the new. So for me, when I I think that that's why the next 10 years are so vital, that we seed the techniques, the methodologies, the frameworks, and as far as we can, like rapidly. And this is why I think it's important to do the Shambhala thing and actually walk into the corridors of power and find the transition means where you're completely not talking to the whole complexity of the situation, but you find the energy in the system to build local energy infrastructure, local food sovereignty, local capacity to clean water. The mistake of this local aha that people are having is this is the third or fourth wave of that. The eco-villages in the 60s were built of that. When my friend Albert Bates stopped being a top-flying lawyer in front of the Supreme Court and got on a yellow bus and ended up at the farm, where he then built plenty and got a right livelihood award and all that. That was exactly the same impulse of relocalization. And I see that there's been previous waves, and this wave that is coming now should really learn from the previous ones, both with regard to the more specific concrete actions that you're talking about of, wait a minute, it's not all about just creating the blingy, all-inclusive, like straw bales, solar panels, little windmill, permaculture garden, aquaculture, blah, 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 putting all the elements together, model community. It's also not about doing all these new builds on brownfield sites or greenfield sites. The big issue is how do we transform the infrastructure that we're already living in? Like one thing, the statistic that a Oxford report in 2009 or 2010, they put out this report about the UK saying by 2050, in the UK, if we look at the picture of the infrastructure, then 80% of that infrastructure is already in existence now. And if you think of it in that way, that in 40 years, most of the infrastructure is still what we hear, then it's all about transforming existing buildings and communities and less about new build. But the other huge lesson is that going from the global focus to the local focus, there's a sweet spot in the middle. Again, the glocal, the synthesis, rather than swinging from this to that. And that's this local notion. What I do locally is actually part of global healing. You cannot heal the earth, you cannot save the planet, but you can save places, you can heal places. And the only way that we can have any effect globally is actually doing the local work and doing our healing here in order to contribute to a process where everybody globally is doing their healing locally. And again, that's where the network comes in, that because of the inequalities, north, south, and so on, we need to resource, both in terms of knowledge, technology, and money and information and all of that, those areas on the planet that are basically underprivileged. But at the same time, those areas actually hold a lot of the inhabitory knowledge of people living in place that need to resource us in this process. So it's not a kind of, oh yeah, we better give back to the poor people in the global south. Fuck that arrogant bullshit. But what I'm getting at, that's why I'm happy to play the game you're inviting me into. But I find when we play that game, we get into the prepper mindset of how do we prep for imminent collapse. And that might also be useful because for some people it will be lived like that, and people in Aleppo have lived it like that along the years ago. So for me, asking me about Mallorca, I feel that right now, even if that keeps spiraling and what you're painting is only 3, 4, 5 years out, and history might correct me, it might be 6 months out. In that time, right now, with the post-COVID recovery funds coming in, Spain gearing up to spend all the European money that is flooding in soon, the big Horizon 1 kind of large institutions trying to propose Horizon 3 visions in order to get to that money, but then doing it in their Horizon 1 way. And so to like mega projects that are led by Endesa or Iberdrola or like large energy and power companies. But there is a huge network swell, like here locally, around how can we make those people who for the last 10 years have actually been doing stuff to build local food sovereignty, water sovereignty, capacity of people in place. How do we foreground them and make sure that at least a few millions go there to really boost that work? And so I'm increasingly pushing, like a friend of mine, I'll send you the link in a minute, has been, from my energetic sense, when he first put this proposal out for the Balearic Islands, I felt like he jumped the gun. He'd done something that we'd been talking about in a small group of people for a long time. He just put it into a proposal and said, I want to do this now. And I wasn't quite ready in my own life rhythm yet to stand in line next to him and say, okay, let's do it together. So I kind of helped him behind the scenes a bit. But now it seems like this whole thing is coming together, and it's basically called Baleares Verde, and it's about the simple communication piece is planting 1 million trees in the Balearic Islands in the next 10 years in food forests all over the island. But that's completely oversimplifying it. It's really building the capacity of people in place to increase the bioproductivity of this island and restore the ecosystems and use this opportunity of the decade of ecosystems restoration and all these mimetic frames we can hang things on to attract the resources into Balearics. So we basically heal those islands and showing how that would be possible in the Mediterranean climate zone, and always seeing it as a sort of test field for bioregions, especially islands along the Mediterranean, but there's 400 million people living around the Mediterranean basin. And another piece that makes this really special is that we have 4 islands that are almost perfectly scaled in size. Formentera, tiny little place, easily turned into, like if you want to show how electric transport works, you can do it in 3 months. Like you could, in 3 months, you could take all the internal combustion engines off that little rock and replace them with renewables and put a few batteries up and show that. Of course, it's only a transition technology, and we don't need to go into electric cars in detail. But then Ibiza is a bit bigger, Menorca is a bit bigger, and Mallorca is actually a pretty good example of a 500,000 people city, slightly less, in a 1 million people region, slightly less. So it becomes, that's why I moved here 10 years ago, it becomes a real case study for bioregional change. And I've been slowly seeding for 10, 12 years here on the island, this question of what would a sustainable Mallorca look like? And identifying the kind of imaginal cells on the island, and we're beginning to create that network between them. And for me, I'm keen to use as much as possible the next years to shift the bioregional infrastructure so that kind of localization you're talking about actually sits in a healthier, more resilient, more capable region. If we fall into the, yes, it's all about local, let's build these model communities, and how do we resource people to build these model communities? That's why I work with Guy Education. The Guy Education course, Eco-Village design or Design for Sustainability, the 125 hours face-to-face and the 400 or 800 hours online course, that already maps the big picture and the big puzzle of all the things that you need to think of when you build community. It already connects you to all the examples and scales it to hundreds of videos, and it's a fractal that people can take that kind of conceptual learning journey and then use what serves in their local area. But what isn't being done is the bioregional thing yet, and that's where I'm at. Sorry for.
So no, wait. It's great. I pushed in the wrong direction with I didn't want to push towards the prepper move. What I intended to do was to create like a clean slate scenario, to free ourselves in the thinking from the game A type of dynamics, because in my experience that reveals blind spots, like you were referring to solar panels and electric vehicles and stuff. To get a solar panel, we have to send a little child into a cave somewhere else on the planet. So that's definitely not a way forward, right? So we need to I'm hyperbolically speaking, of course, but we need to find other ways of turning sunlight into electric energy and storing that stuff, etc. So that's one of those blind spots, right? Slapping existing technology all over the place is a very, very high level, luxurious first world thing to do. And that's what I mean by, that's where I wanted to go. That was my intention.
I see. This is why I find the three horizons so useful. I agree and I disagree with that analysis, because it is actually very useful to build transition technologies and enable, like, because we know, and Florian was here being where he is right now. When you go into that stage of collapse scenario, then all that kind of, let's come together and build collaborative abundance becomes quite a lot more difficult. So if we're in a transition phase where in certain, like, basically it is possible to create photovoltaic panels in a place out of local resources without all the rat's tail that you're describing. It is also, for maybe another 10, 15, 20 years, okay if people promote the move from internal combustion engines to electric cars, because we need to radically decarbonize transport. And if the other option is that people just keep driving what they're driving, we're creating a massive problem with climate. So it's again, like, wherever when we start painting things in these simplified hyperbolic dualisms, we're not doing a service. We need to pay attention to the second horizon space, where certain technologies are H2 plus technologies. They're not where we want to end up, but they're stepping stones to H3. And other technologies, and often it's the same technology but used differently and built into a different structural component, are H2 minus technologies. They're just there to keep H1 running for a little bit longer. And all the renewables, whether it's electric cars, solar panels, windmills, all of that. Of course, ultimately, if you look at it across the periodic table, we're going to run out of every element in the periodic table apart from carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Those are the four elements that nature builds with. And in a different world, in a different life parallel stream, I'm working with a guy who spent the last 15 years doing nothing but research into Chon and what the leading technological areas are, where we actually are building the technology for, like, Ian is a futurist thinker. He says, like, just to give you a sense of the guy, says, problem with electric cars, problem with all kinds of cars that have wheels. There's a reason why nature hasn't invented wheels. Wheels need flat surfaces that reduce friction. Problem, if we get out of the fossil fuel industry, we don't have the byproducts of the fossil fuel industry anymore. We don't have tarmac. We don't have something to make flat surfaces with. So transport of the future, phase change materials, scuttlings, micro transport devices that are basically like spider legs on a chair, that move across uneven terrain if you want to
or
play,
flying.
Yeah, if you want to play futurist, yeah. But Ian is the kind of geeky technologist who actually looks at every new material science innovation in chemistry, in physics, in technology, to look at how can we make a windmill also produce the core chemical elements when it's running idle, to create a local cottage industry that isn't a going back to a kind of indigenous past living by candlelight, but is actually marrying the best of both worlds and creates a local, new, appropriate high tech. Anyway,
I love it. I love it because it feels like in all of these dimensions that structure my thinking are in there, and also my activity are in there. There's so many things I would love to share now, but I think I'm not going to hijack this space now. But it also feels like you're 3 steps ahead. And so I would really love now to go back into your bioregion train of thought, and explore that. How is the concrete implementation of a bioregion coherence happening? How's that pan out in your mind?
That's super. Again, it's a question putting me on my spot in the sense of what I own, what I grapple with. Like, and that's like, I really mean it when I talk about living the questions. Like, as much as I kind of sometimes push back and go into monologues, I don't know. I mean, I'm living the questions. I sense what makes sense. Whenever I get strong about something, it's because I've seen a biological pattern that I believe that's how life operates. And when we fall out of that, then I feel like we're probably making a mistake. But I feel a bit uncomfortable with, over the last few years, and somehow I must have invited that myself in the way I've been communicating. Too many people have started to talk about Daniel's project on Mallorca. And what Daniel is doing on Mallorca. And that makes me feel terribly uncomfortable and actually creates a huge potential to backfire and have this whole process blow up in my face locally. If only a few people locally say, who's this fucking arrogant German prick who, like so many other Germans who've come to this island, sits there and from his position of privilege tells us here on this island what to do with this island. That would be really fucking difficult to crisis manage if we get to that point. And the more people speak of Daniel's project on Mallorca, and a good friend of mine, he's in one of the more right-wing newspapers, but he's actually a ecological activist and has been for a long time, and he seeds memes in this right-wing newspaper, but is frustrated by their editorial policy. Anyway, he wrote a piece in El Mundo about my work on Mallorca, and he was just trying to be supportive, and he was speaking to it as he sees it. He wasn't trying to big it up, but it was far too much of that. And so I'm asking myself, how do I take a role in this ecosystem, like I have done for the last 12 years of giving public talks, asking questions, working with different bodies, like working a lot with education, helping to create. First, it was something called La Academia Mallorca, where we, together with a friend who initiated it, we brought together about 25 trainers, psychologists, people that have lots of diverse skill set, to then use the curriculum that a guy in Barcelona had developed it was a master's in personal development. And he, after teaching 40-year-olds on a master's in personal development for 5 or 6 years successfully, he hit the wall with it and said, this is frustrating. It'll never end. There'll be more and more of these burnout 40-year-olds. What are we doing wrong with the teenagers that we give them the wrong thinking and framing tools and narrative, so they end up at 40 burned out? So he just made an experiment. He said, I'm going to teach exactly the same curriculum to teenagers for free. And all I want is their commitment to show up at all the sessions. And it went kind of viral in terms of the attention. And a friend here locally said, we can do this. And she wanted to bring him over. And he said, no, I don't want to travel all the time to Mallorca. Why don't you do it? And she then crowdsourced it among these 20 professionals. And we ran this La Academia Mallorca for kids between 13 and 19. And then the parents said, this is so amazing what my kids come home with when they talk about these sessions. Where can I sign up? And so we created La Escuela de Padres, and we ran that for a number of years. That is transformative work, but it's completely under the radar. I worked with the Baleares T, the local innovation and tourism business cluster that had been set up with European money and supported by a couple of big tourism companies here, to weave local production into the consumption of hotels years ago. And to ask this question, what would a sustainable Mallorca look like, when people were literally coming up afterwards and saying, I don't even know what sustainability means. I don't know how to create a sustainable company. And you're talking about a sustainable Mallorca. Have you lost it? It's a scale that my brain doesn't compute. Now they're all talking about those kind of level of change. I can show you, like I actually have it here because I've just moved. Where is it? This was a report in 2012 where I used the word systems model, and in all the blue things, like there's 12 nodes around sustainable island, and then all of that is kind of ideas of what you could do in each of these areas. And if you look at what the public discourse has moved on from when I put that out to now, you can see that things are changing. And I'm not pretending that I have created all that change, but the celebrated climate change response strategy of the Balearics, that the guy who wrote it then moved on to become in charge of the Ministry of the Ecological Transition in the head government. That Spain has a Ministry of Ecological Transition. There were 12 points in that plan, and 11 of them are on that map. But moving forward, rather than, I could go on lots of projects of what I've done over the time. Another one that is actually also really lovely, is together with another friend who's been, and he's a local, and he's really done amazing work here on the island. He was the chief designer of Camper shoes in the 90s. He built the Camper brand, the whole thing that Camper is cool and they're sort of in connection with the land, and the whole project of in 95 creating the Chameleon, Europe's first eco-label kind of recycled green shoe. That was radical product design innovation in the 90s. And when Camper decided we can make more money by producing in China, he said, love you guys, you're my best friends, we'll build a company together, but I'm off, I'm done. And he retired and got himself a nice house on the hill and invited Fukuoka to help him set up his One Straw Revolution permaculture garden. And since then, he's been using this connection with the Camper company, getting little grants, 5,000 or 15, 20,000 to run events. And he's been running an event called Poc a Poc, very Mallorcan term, little by little. That's how Mallorcans work. And he's been bringing Satish Kumar and Vandana Shiva, and Satish has come every year for by now 16 years or something like that. And then Gunter Pauli, Fritjof Capra, David Orr, lots of people, the Jacksons from Gaia Education and Global Eco-Village Network, lots of like the lady who started Attack, and everybody coming through initially a bit of a kind of eco-elite talking shop in the guy's house, the same 200 people talking about, aren't we elite and let's save the world. But then when I moved here, and again, that's just a little bit systemic Aikido. How do you change a region? Well, I don't know. I had a conversation with Guillaume where I said to him head on, nobody else dared to challenge him like that. Guillaume, you're doing fantastic work, but it's a talking shop. It's always the same 200 people. Nothing is moving. Do these events, but do them with the teachers of the island, and things will start transforming. And boom, the next year, he made the event public to the teachers of the Balearic Islands in an old convent, and had 400 teachers attending when Satish and Fritjof and when Vandana were talking about systems view of life, ecological conscious, local food, soil, soul, and society. And that kind of thing transforms. And what I'm hoping now is to create a bioregional learning center to make these stories more visible to each other and to tell them so people can have a place to engage.
So can I take a moment to like put some words to the image that has been emerging while you were speaking, to see whether I'm actually understanding? What I'm hearing or seeing or feeling is that you, in a sense, creating, doing things that increase the probability of actors in that bioregion to weave something, some social fabric, some intellectual fabric, some spiritual fabric, some cultural fabric. So you're somewhere there and nudging here and nudging there and orchestrating, maybe even, and it's a bit like you're kneading the dough while being in the dough yourself.
It's a lovely image. It's precisely that shift. Like, I mean, I can terribly theoretical about this, but basically the fundamental shift in science that has happened with complexity theory is that through the chaotic dynamic that Poincaré first pointed out in the three-body problem, that once you have three interacting variables, you cannot predict and control a system. It's a fundamentally mathematically unpredictable and uncontrollable system. And therefore, every complex dynamic system, and that's a cell, an organ, a body, a community, certainly a socio-ecological system, even far more, is fundamentally unpredictable and uncontrollable. And yet, because we're based on science that tells an outdated story that doesn't listen to itself, that says, oh yeah, but we can predict and control so much. And even Jim, coming from computing, falls a little bit into this. Let's just throw big data and computing power at it, and we can wrestle predictability from complexity theory. It's yes, of course, within limited time and space frames, within frameworks of abstraction, not real life. Real life is always more messy than computer models. Fucking get it. The whole idea of building an Earth 2 and modeling our future in parallel is just a waste of fucking resources. And what I'm talking about is, once you really embrace that you cannot predict and control the future, that there's a paradox in designing regenerative cultures. Cultures emerge, they don't get designed. But you can design for positive emergence in complex systems. You can create the enabling conditions for what emerges to be positive and not negative, because that's the other linguistic framing mistake. Like in our networks, so many people kind of have these flimsical uses of the words of emergence that they say, well, the emergence will help us. It's like that's saying, yes, serendipity will help us, or fat chance will help us. Like in complex system, new properties and dynamics emerge. And how do we seed, weave, knead the dough while we're in it? How do we, and what I learned from Brian Goodwin at Schumacher College, who's one of the like very close friends of Stuart Kaufman and was there at the beginning of that whole complexity conversation, is on the one hand that the biggest lesson is uncertainty and unpredictability, and that we need to take that to heart, and that we fall into the old habit of saying, yeah, we give lip service to it, and then we do the old game. If you fully radically embrace uncertainty and not knowing with humility, then you have that dual role in complex systems that on the one hand, everything you do matters critically because they're sensitive to initial conditions. And at the same time, you can't predict and control it. So it's audacity and humility in a packet. And what Brian told me is, how do you influence positive emergence? It's about the quality of information that flows into the system. It's the quality of relationships in the system and connecting the right actors to like thoughts and frameworks and capabilities and tools to the right people, to the right agents in the system. And it is also about making the system see itself and provide rapid feedback of where the system is going. And of course, because in the human system, it is about narrative and vision of future story, but where these visions are like lighthouses you never reach, you only sail past. And
that's why I call them horizons. Sorry to interrupt, but that's why I call them horizons, because a horizon moves with you. You never reach it, and it's always in the fog. So you need it, but you'll never reach it.
Yeah.
What you say now is the reason that I 20 years ago called my business school Emergence. So it's called Emergence, and I love the old story about. Do you know the story of Lloyd Morgan?
No, please tell.
He was a biologist in 1928, and he studied ants. And he said, if you take two groups of ants, they'll kill each other, but do you put them in the back and shake them together? They'll build a reality and the world together. Because then they smell the same.
Mm-hmm.
So this is about how a simple animal like that can build a really amazing system. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that if they are forced to talk together, then they build together instead of fight each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what you are doing here is that you are basically saying what you said, which is really powerful. We should build an ecological sustainable region, right? Which means that if you do that, the reality will shift, and then you force people into that conversation or invite them, to use your language.
Everything that is too abstract when we sit at COP and talk about how to save the planet and transform industry becomes real and messy and able to learn from place when you give it that enabling constraint of saying we have to. I mean, if the UN did one thing right, then they should say we've been putting out lots of messages. There's one message that in terms of the transformation now needed. Right now, we maybe have 20% local, 80% global relationships, resource flows and energy flows and all that. We need to turn it around. We need to enable regions to be 80% regional. And that isn't the radical, because we're shooting ourselves just as much in the knee with radical regionalization that is then hijacked by preppers and even far-right xenophobic assholes. Like that's the danger of bioregionalism, is that some people use it for that agenda when they create this lifeboat meme and the world's going to shits, all collapse, we need to build lifeboats. And that's also the danger of the eco-village thing. Like I lived it in Finland, like the simple question in this breakdown scenario Thomas was inviting. If we at Finton, with our community-supported agriculture and our wind farm and our local currency and our 50 years of spiritual, social community building, so we can be with differences and conflict and still move forward together, would have been in a breakdown scenario, how long would it have taken for guys with a machete from Glasgow to find out that these guys still have a bit of food and a bit of energy, let's go up there. And in that moment, you can only decide to build a fence and be in a situation like Florian is right now, and like shooting the rockets of the others from the sky, or you open your garden and say, here, we don't have enough for all of us. You've got machetes that can be used as tools. How do we work together? And it's that, therefore I don't want to create another little lifeboat, because they're not functional. If anything, it's the region, because
it's an illusion.
yeah,
it will never happen. So either we create small islands, like the quote I put on in the chat, which is actually my favorite quote in what we are talking about. Either we create these small islands that inspire the big systems, or else there is no solution.
yeah, lovely, love it. That's beautiful. I'm going to copy that. Thank you for that.
It's my absolute favorite. It captures all we have been talking about.
Absolutely brilliant quote. Thank you. That's a gift. I'll just send it to myself.
I'd like to this image about being part of the system while you are changing the system. This is probably the most complex thing I can imagine a human could be doing. And
it's being human. That's the nature of being.
But it's really radical, because instead of going into some kind of, like 70% of people in the West find their work meaningless, right? To some extent, or whatever it is. But it's basically living your highest capacity to some degree. Choose to live a life where you actually create the reality you would like to live in yourself. That's actually the project we are talking about. And do we know how to do it? No. But it's choosing a meaningful life and being responsible for creating your life in a meaningful way that we are talking about, isn't it?
But why, Daniel, do you say that this is being human?
Not just being human. I believe that or
being life.
It's precisely the game A narrative, the story of separation, that has so inoculated us with a perception of self and agency as opposed to other, that we believe that there's something out there that we're looking at, and there's something that we are. Whereas all being, all life, all being is always in the polarity between being for oneself and at the very same time being as part of a larger whole. Mm-hmm. And that means, like, you're yourself and you're the earth. And that means that everything you do to yourself in terms of your own health and your activities is changing this larger system that you're also literally an emergent property of. Okay. And therefore, that's why I'm saying it's the very structure of life that we're constantly, either consciously or non-consciously, transforming, like co-creating the future.
I think I want to pick on and be more precise on what I'm trying to find out, which is if you look at developmental psychology, Keegan and all the rest, there is something that points towards that it becomes increasingly possible to live and integrate what you just said, instead of just intellectually understanding it. So I can intellectually understand that I'm part of a system, and that my actions have some consequence in the system, and then everybody starts talking about the butterfly and the chaos theory, or I can do what you are doing on the island or islands, and weaving this fabric. And it seems like, to me, it seems like it's almost a dreamlike state. It's an intuitive thing. It cannot be thought. It cannot be planned, but it can be lived. And the question then is, this is probably the core of the pirate quality that we're looking for. And the question is, how do you get there? How is that called? What do you do? That is the real meat that I'm trying to grasp here. Does it make sense?
Yeah, no, makes perfect sense, and it's the sometimes I wonder whether the getting there is always in the specific of each individual's journey, or it is abstractable. The danger is how do you get there? When you ask me, I can speak from my experience, but that's with my entire bundle of privileges and my own story informing this. How do you get there? Whether I'm correct that that's how you get there, well, it helped me see it that way. And for me, I can see tensions on that journey, which is partially to do with the most powerful agency in a system is to offer new organizing ideas and new possibilities into the system and new methods and ways of seeing that actually bring forth a different world for people. And when they take them on, ideally they take them on as theirs. So you become entirely invisible and you don't get any credit for the work you've been doing. Like if you concede ideas in the minds of other people and they believe them so fully that they give their all in realizing them because they believe they're their ideas. And then of course you can zoom out and say, these ideas aren't yours or mine or anybody's anyway. Yeah? Then you have, I think, a much higher agency than if you need to keep being acknowledged for that. But then, of course, Game A playing field makes it very hard for people to act in that way, because the only way that you get resourced for what you're doing is to be recognized for what you're doing. And so that's why people are hungry for recognition. Academics need to be quoted in order to be seen as sensible academics, and even activists need to be like, and that's why on the quoting up, but also like giving reference also serves for people to be able to understand lineage and deepen their learning. So it's not an ego trip, which is also often mistaken. But in terms of how do you train up people to become these kind of change agents that ideally catalyze change without making a brand out of it and an ego trip out of it? It's a question I'm living, but I find it hard to answer it because for many years I've been living on a shoestring and with a kind of coasting horizons of 3 to 6 months, meaning income stream completely cut off because whatever I'm ill, within 6 months I would have been kicked out of where I was living and been in the street. And now I've, partially because of the privilege of inheritance and birth, inherited a bit of money to be able to buy my own piece of land that I don't see as my land, that I feel much more that I now am owned by this land and I'm a custodian and steward of it. But legally in the Game A system, it's on a record book that I'm the owner. Yeah? And how do I transform those structures without being radical? Like somebody out there in my networks could easily say, well, then give it away. Yeah? But maybe that's not the right way to deal with the privilege of ownership. Maybe it's modeling new ways of holding ownership and dissolving it slowly. And for me, that's why I think that there's so many structural innovations that we need to enable positive emergence. Like my friend Claudian Dubosch, if he's not on your radar, he should be. He's a Romanian who lived a long time in Portugal, and he was involved with the Global Eco Village Network, but also critically involved in setting up Ecolis, the European network of sustainable community initiatives. And he's got a project on at the moment. They're creating something called Terra Livre, which is basically regenerative land trusts. How do you transfer land into trust ownership where the land ultimately owns itself, or in perpetuity, but those who work the land and live on the land have tenure on the land even through generations, as long as they stick with the custodian making the land, doing their bit to make the land regenerate and more fertile. And I think these vehicles are so critical now.
There's maybe you've heard of Juri Torfs.
Pardon?
Juri Torfs. I'll send you an email with a bunch of links later, and put it in, because he's implementing something very, very similar.
Juri
Torfs. Juri Torfs.
But Christian, could you, Daniel, could you please send some of the links that you talked about as well?
Yeah, sure.
But I think you just said what is the main purpose, at least to me, for what we are doing. Is this question: how do you train people to be these change agents? That's basically what interests at least me. And then you said another thing that is a core design principle, that how do we actually live our questions, which to some degree is an elaboration of what Gandhi said, that we all love and heard in our childhood, right? How do you become the change you want to see in the world? But how do we actually live? The questions is addressing what is it that you try to understand with our lives to become reality. That is the most meaningful place to be, and that you address by saying, how can we live our questions and just instead of just talking them? And then one specific question for me, because I'm part of creating this education now, and I'm part of a project taking the Norwegian, the Nordic folk high school to the rainforest to empower people there. Where is the centers on which place on earth are at the moment the center of how we should train people in this paradigm? Of course, Schumacher College is one, but where is this dialogue most vibrant and most vital at the moment?
Oof, that's a big question. I'm not sure that anybody is fully there yet with regard to a center, a place. It's again is there one set of education tools that we can deliver or create that would do that for people, or is it where I would put my energy? If like it's been something that for a long time. You know, sometimes you have these projects that on the one hand you feel like you should do because you have personal relationships in a network and you feel in a position that you could maybe pull this together, and at the same time you sort of look at it and go, it's a shed lot of work and really hard, and do I want to live my life and put energy into that? And this building this global network is something that for a long time I've been sensing that is something necessary to do, but it's really hard work. How do we build some form of a map and this credit system and mutual connection system between all the people that are already offering different forms of capacity building to enable these pirate learners, pirates in training, pirate apprentices, to navigate their own path through an ecosystem offer that has virtual and residential, that has living and learning type possibilities, that has these synergetic win-wins where you do a bit of learning, but you do it in a different country, so you actually also get kind of an intercultural experience and possibly learn another language. But we bring them all make them more accessible so people don't take 20 years of a path of learning to find all these watering holes and drink from them to then eventually write a book about it and like it was my path. Like I have been deeply influenced by 3 centers in the UK, and each one of them is giving me something that the others haven't had. So Schumacher is one of them, Findhorn is another, and the Center for Alternative Technology is yet another. And where Schumacher is brilliant on the intellectual side of things, it kind of celebrates the, but we're turning it into practice, and it's doing that more than it did when I first was there in 2001 now, but it's still very intellectual. And Findhorn is much more heart-based and living it in a community with all its pros and cons. And Cat is very technical and practical, but each one of them has been part of my learning. But then I could also say that like the connection into the way of council work and connection with the Ojai Foundation, for example, or the Vision Quest work of the School of Lost Borders, both of them are in California, have also been critical elements in my own learning. And then Gaia Education grew out of the Eco-Village network, but then the Gaia Education took a more, let's take this message to the mainstream and rebrand ourselves a bit away from the Eco-Village and the Woolly Sock Brigade. And eventually the Woolly Sock Brigade said, oh, they've gone so far, they're a different organization. Now we're going to create our own educational offers. And so even in 2 babies that were born out of the same philanthropic impulse, both funded by Ross Jackson, you actually have this stupid situation that we've all seen in so many of our areas, like that often the founders of a new way of doing things fall out, like Beck and Cohen or those kind of things. Similarly, Jen and Gaia Education, I've been trying to come back together for about 5 or 6 years, and they're still very dysfunctional in those patterns. It's silly that they're offered to like the same education under different branding. And in the process of creating Gaia Education, Gaia University spun out because it was actually Andy and Leora who were part of the conversation of creating the curriculum that Gaia Education took to the world. But they wanted to go straight to being a university, and the eco-villages wanted to do living and learning centers around eco-villages at that point in the late 90s. And so Gaia University said, we've got a way of getting certified, we're going to run in that direction, and then also stuck with the action learning as the core of their bit, which is much more in terms aligned with the Pirate Academy, that it's enabling individuals to do what they want to do in their community anyway and get their degree around the process of doing that. So the danger right now is that lots of people are going to reinvent the wheel instead of creating for the Greta Thunberg generation the dynamic navigation tool that says, this is how we all can come together. Like you have all these offers in so many places, and there needs to be some sort of categorizing and vetting of quality. But like if you
but I'd like to, because I've been there too, and in a very concrete way 6 years ago when we had the influx of newcomers in Germany. Also called the refugee crisis, and like so many friends of mine, me included, we all started some nonprofit organization to contribute towards that situation or solving that situation. And what we saw was that there were so many doing the same thing, like reinventing the wheel all over, like in every part of the town here in Berlin, but also in every part of the country. Everybody was reinventing that and wasting a lot of time and energy and resources, etc. And there were some attempts to coordinate that, and it didn't work. And I think I haven't solved it for myself, but I think it's part of this, or could be looked at in the same way as we were talking about that messy reality, that wet stuff that somehow we're molding and part of at the same time. I think the best technology to do this categorization and the qualification over time also, because there's an arrow and things should be allowed to die within that curriculum, or whatever you want to call it. The best technology out there to solve this are humans, right? So and I think this is where I see, I don't know how at all how to start or govern this, but this is where I see the Pirate Academy more or less being a bunch of people selected for a specific trait of mindset that is required right now, which is somewhere in the between shaman and builder, and put them together, give them access to conversations like this one, cutting edge thinkers, but also mutual support. And I think out of that, if done right, we can actually see what matters to whom, when, where, why, all of these things. That's what I'm at least hoping for.
Two things. This might be interesting because I'm not completely up to speed on where they're at, but I would be happy to make an introduction and maybe invite them into a conversation between five of us or six of us, as Florian comes back to the conversation. Andy Langford, who was behind setting up Gaia University, and Andy Goldring, who's behind for a long time has been a real kind of leader from behind in the Permaculture Association in the UK. They are working on this credit system platform that would enable at least learners to take these journeys of doing a course here and a course there and so on, but putting them, like finding a kind of universal unit of currency, so to speak, that you gain X amount of credits for each one of these courses, but then you have your little passport that you create your own portfolio of learning experiences that you chose. And when you get to a certain amount of credits collected, then that collective body, a global experience, some of institutions are 40, 50 years old, body of educational providers in that wider, very diffuse space, accredits you to have reached an equivalent level of these other degrees that in Game A means so much. And I think increasingly people who are looking for what is your education will value that kind of education more than even a degree from MIT or any of those elite ivory towers.
I'd totally love to explore that, and it's something that popped up in my mind that keeps popping up. So it's, I think, maybe worth mentioning. So if you look at the meta-modern, the meta-modernists haven't invented it; they're using it. The mindset complexity idea. So if you measure vertical mindset complexity, which is at least in an approximation measurable, that is one way of grading in a system that is created by the consumer, so to say, by the user of the education system, right? So they choose their content, but as they choose their content, they're increasing their mindset complexity. So you can measure that, but you can also on a second dimension credit what kind of software you're capable of running on your complex mind. Because just because you have a high complexity of mindset doesn't mean you're automatically running certain pieces of software. Well, so having and a certain piece of software is more like the horizontal axis of potential skills, and the vertical axis of mindset complexity shows more how can you integrate complexity.
Just briefly, this is interesting for me, that framing, because I noticed that I'm much more on that vertical integration level, and I sometimes bump in my networks and even friends, wider weavers in the global system, into people who really go all the way into, like, for example, I've done the TRP, and I love what I've learned from Carol Sanford and from Regenerative group, and I do create other spaces where I learn with them and from them, but I just feel a little bit put off by this, like, being invited into this learning community that then becomes a bit cultish and cliquish and clannish around one person. Similarly, whether it's dragon dreaming as a technology or theory, they can become cultish and clannish in their own areas, or the same with the integral community, and then split up in different subsets. But that relates to this other piece that I have with this question of, as we build such a system as described earlier in these credits, are we paying enough attention to what for me is another one of those drop-in core insights of spiral dynamics that, like, as also issues, is this talk to people where they're at and not where you want them to be. Ultimately, you can also reframe it more in that term of, we need to tell the story in 6 or 7 different frames, completely, the whole story, because we need to offer entry points for people at all areas of the spiral. And if we create an education program among us who are maybe somewhere on that, we will weave in our own biases and our own favorite languages. Like, so for example, like, I hear you say shaman, and I can hold that lightly and hear where you're coming from and what you mean with it and have no issue with it. But I know lots of people who just that particular word use will trigger them into a whole different way of seeing you, interpreting what you say. Some will find it positive, others will find it an appropriation of indigenous language and terminology, and
for those people, I would use the term diplomat, but but yeah, you're absolutely right. I totally get that. I'm in a kind of like a tight spot here, because I've been pushing out a team meeting for 15 minutes now.
I think we could probably continue talking, and it would be 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And
I agree, and to be very honest, we've never ever extended a call in the Pirate Academy ever. We always ended on time, so this is the first time, and this is to me a really amazing indicator that this is just the beginning of a conversation. That's what it feels to me. So I hope you feel the same, but I also hope that if you don't feel the same, you tell us. And I hope even more that we actually get to meet in a physical space, maybe on the island. I have some other friends there too that I'd love to meet, and I'm actually also going to connect you with. But or somewhere here, or in Oslo, or in Israel when things settle down. So, and really explore this in concrete terms and deeply.
Yeah, here, just as a, hold on, I just want to give you a very quick, oops, no, wrong one, stop sharing, sorry. I know you need to go. So this is where I'm sitting right now, and this is the garden, and this is a old threshing platform where they traditionally separated the wheat from the chaff in the big wheat field that this was. And this is a very good place to sit in the evening in a circle and have this conversation in real time. And if it's too hot, then under here there are 2 mulberry trees that offer a wonderful shade. So you're invited. Let's have the conversation in real time, or while walking through the Tramontana.
And without teams waiting in the call. Open-ended. Open-ended.
Yeah. No, it's a necessary conversation to have, and yeah, it's.
Thank you for having it with us. Thank you.
Let's
really appreciate it.
Okay, have a wonderful day, and just get in touch in terms of when to continue and how to continue.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we all integrated for a day, and then we will all hear from each other.
Okay, lots of love. Have a wonderful day.
You
Bye.
too. Ciao.